In the original Mobile Suit Gundam series, and throughout the Universal Century timeline, humanity decides to migrate its growing population to space in gigantic orbiting space colonies. In about half a century, 9 billion of the 11 billion total human population migrates to space and the moon in order to allow Earth's environment to recover from human pollution and overconsumption of resources. On paper, this all may sound like it was the right thing to do in order to ensure the continuation of life on Earth. In fact, to some, it may even seem like it was the only option in order to deal with the rapidly increasing human population. After all, although it took humans 100,000 years to reach 1 billion in 1804, it only took another 123 years for us to get to 2 billion in 1927. It would then only take another 33 years for the population to reach 3 billion in 1960. And after that, in 14 years, we got to 4 billion in 1974. So, it may seem as if all the world's governments working together to move us all to space and creating the Universal Century was a noble cause that had everyone's best interest. But I'm here to propose a theory that by trying to solve overpopulation, the Earth Federation government only made things worse by sending most of the population to space, and as a result, doomed the Universal Century to fail from the start. In short, the Universal Century failed because it was based on the false belief that the population's exponential growth would continue unchecked, which led to the overreaction that kept humanity stuck in a transitional phase by constantly building space colonies, and thus resulted in growing animosity between Earth and the colonies. To begin with, the idea of overpopulation being the basis for space colonization was false, because there is no such thing as unlimited growth. Populations either level off or decline at different rates depending on a number of different conditions. If you're a young adult or older, you've most likely already heard some form of argument that states that there simply is not enough resources for everyone, and that war, famine, disease, and natural disasters are necessary to keep the population from growing too fast. This stems from the overpopulation theory, also known as the Malthusian theory, which was presented by English economist and demographer Thomas Malthus. In his essay on the principle of population from 1798, he presented the rather bleak theory that population growth will always tend to outrun the food supply, and that the betterment of mankind is impossible without strict limits on reproduction. It is worth noting that Thomas Malthus was born into a prosperous family, and he never addressed either the industrial or agricultural revolution that happened during his lifetime. Kingsley Davis, an American sociologist and demographer, remarked that although Malthus's theory was based on a strong empirical foundation, they tended to be weakest in his empiricism. Basically, that he never handled his work with much critical or statistical rigor, even though statisticians in Europe and England had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques during his lifetime. Despite the overpopulation theory being dismissed by academics, that didn't stop governments from creating policies based on Malthus's theory well into the 20th and 21st century when it came to shifting blame and responsibility for various issues a country may have. One such policy influenced by Malthus was the English Poor Law in 1834. What the Poor Law did was create workhouses for the poor, and it was only if they lived in these workhouses that they could qualify for government relief programs. Even then, the relief programs were only available to the sick and elderly, and even still, the sick and elderly were sometimes denied access to relief. For everyone else, conditions in the workhouses were deliberately made to be worse, to discourage the poor from being lazy and idle. Even at the time, the Poor Law was seen as punishing the poor for simply being poor, and it received much criticism as a lazy way to save on government spending, while completely ignoring the fact that the government lost more money through poor management of its funds and corruption. In short, policies like the Poor Law and others like it are intended to pass off the blame onto the poor and underrepresented. Why fix ourselves when we can pass off the blame and shame onto everyone else? This line of thinking could have easily been what encouraged the elites of the Earth Federation to build the space colonies. Rather than change their ways of life and consume less resources, the top 10% of the population decided to use overpopulation as an excuse to send everyone else out to space. This can even be seen here today in the real world. As the population surpasses 8 billion, some still try to pass off climate change and the depletion of natural resources as an overpopulation problem, all the while completely ignoring that nearly half of all the world's resources are consumed by just 10% of the population, thus showing that the reality is not an overpopulation problem, but rather an overconsumption problem. The Universal Century was essentially created from a form of Malthusian theory, or to be more accurate, Neo-Malthusian, which is the concern that overpopulation as well as overconsumption may increase resource depletion and lead to environmental degradation and ecological collapse or other hazards. Ironically, moving everyone to space is likely what caused the population to reach 11 billion and only made things worse for everyone and the Earth's environment. By moving most of the population into space, humanity continued to grow because it was stuck in a transitional phase. To explain, we only need to look at what is known as a demographic transition model, a model used to measure the changes in human population in correlation with long-term changes in the economy. This is broken down into 4 stages. The first is the pre-industrial stage, where living conditions are harsh and technology and medical advances have yet to become widespread. Birth rates are high, but so too is the death rate. What follows is a transitional stage. This is where industrialization begins. Food production and healthcare improve, and death rates drop faster than the birth rate, meaning that there's usually a large increase in population density. This is typically the stage we tend to see most developing countries to be in, and where we see faster growth in population. Stages 3 and 4 are the industrial and post-industrial stages, where birth rates decline more significantly as couples want smaller families. The post-industrial stage being where the population growth actually becomes negative. For this video, we'll primarily be focusing on the second stage. In the universal century, think of each colony as a city-state. Just building one would require a massive workforce, not just for the construction of it, but also building the land and infrastructure inside of it, meaning countless jobs would need to be created, in which will no doubt bring in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of workers to each colony. Basically, meaning each colony while under construction is a developing small nation, where birth rates will no doubt increase as many workers would soon earn enough income to start families of their own. It would be similar to when people left the countryside to find work in the cities. Even after a colony is completed, with the population still increasing, more colonies would need to continue being constructed, meaning that every colonial site would be stuck in the transitional and industrial stages of the demographic transition model. Had it not been for the construction of the space colonies, the human population would have likely never reached 11 billion. In fact, the population would have shrunk, much like how we see it shrink in the more developed countries of today. And although space is a big place, that doesn't exactly mean that there are enough resources within reach, let alone enough space for everyone, meaning that there would have likely been strict restrictions on space nodes. And so, in time, resentment would start to grow towards those still living on Earth and who still refuse to grant the colonies their independence. With the restrictions placed on the colonists and a lack of representation within the ruling Earth Federation government, it was only a matter of time before independence movements began to take shape throughout the colonies. From Earth's perspective, allowing the majority of the population that now lived in space to govern themselves was far too risky. Doing so could result in the Federation losing its power and influence, and the ruling Earth elite will lose the rights to most, if not all, the resources brought in from space. Meanwhile, the space noids wouldn't be able to shake off the feeling that they had been lied to and scammed whenever they looked at the Earth elites still living on Earth. They were told that moving to space was the right thing to do. Although many left believing this, they would then see the Earth government and the rest of the elites still living as they had before the mass migration to space. In 1971, the Keep America Beautiful commercial first aired on television. In the commercial, a Native American rides a canoe and paddles down river, starting off in the outdoors and eventually making his way to the city, where we gradually see an increase in pollution and waste. The commercial ends with the Native American looking up at the camera with a single tear falling down the side of his face. The commercial was successful in making everyday people in the United States want to do their part in recycling to protect the environment. On the surface, it seemed like the commercial was made with the best intentions. Except, it wasn't. The commercial was made by the packaging industry and large companies like Pepsi and Cola in order to protect their profits by not having to spend on recycling themselves, even though they pollute far more than the combined general population. In a similar way, albeit on a much larger scale with added steroids, the universal century plan to migrate the majority of the population to space had the same purpose: to pass off the blame of overconsumption and pollution onto the rest. In time, those living in space would catch on to the truth in some form or another through different ideologies and theories. As a result, various wars and smaller conflicts were unavoidable. Groups like Xeon and the Crossbone Vanguard would eventually exploit the people's frustrations and take extreme steps for independence at any cost. Earth-funded groups like the Titans, intended to keep the peace, would push the space noids too far with their extreme methods for keeping the peace. And whenever the Earth Federation became too weak, groups like the Zanskar Empire would take advantage and attack. The universal century, even if it had lasted over 1,000 years, had nothing to show for itself in the end. Space colonization was largely limited to just orbiting artificial living environments and the moon. There may have been a few expeditions sent out beyond the asteroid belt, but nothing more than that. Not even a terraformed Mars. With such rapid growth, the risk of population collapse was also a very real possibility, as demographers have seen similar trends in other animal populations. Once exponential growth reaches its peak, the decline can be just as steep, if not more. By the time Gundam Reconquista NG takes place, the Universal Century had been replaced by the Reguild series. The colony sides were no more, while Earth's resources were more depleted than ever before, and the population fell to at least half of what it used to be in the Universal Century, thus finalizing the failure of the Universal Century. But of course, that's just my theory.